All right, this is an excerpt of the 9/11 Commission, where the panelist Slade Gorton interviews the former uh, counterterrorism coordinator of the National Security Council under the Clinton and Bush Jr. administrations, Richard Clarke. Let's play the video.
Mr. Clarke, you got the position as the head of this counterterrorism and security group, CSG, when in about May of 1998, is that correct?
No, Senator, actually, I got it in the first Bush administration in the fall of 1992.
But it got the level of being up there at the White House and being a very important position in 1998?
What happened in 1998, let me go back. The Counterterrorism Security Group, the CSG, goes back to the Reagan administration. It's been around for that long. I started chairing it during the last few months of the Bush administration in 1992. Continued to chair it throughout the Clinton administration and into the second Bush administration. In 1998, President Clinton signed a presidential directive that created a new title for the chairman of that group. The chairman had always been a special assistant to the president. That was the title. Under the new directive in 1998, the title became National Coordinator for Counterterrorism. But I think there's something I need to say about that title. The actual title was National Coordinator for Security, Infrastructure Protection, and Counterterrorism. And the press, thinking that title was too long and not sexy enough, immediately turned it into Terrorism Czar. If you look at the Presidential Decision Directive in 1998 that created this position, it is replete with what the National Coordinator cannot do and what resources the National Coordinator would not have. It was not a counterterrorism czar, especially when compared to people like the drug czar. It was
a staff position, not an action, not an action position, in other words.
It gave me all of the responsibility and none of the authority.
So whatever ideas that he could come up with, whatever operations that he could come up with, and they're not actionable. But it wasn't, and Clarke is one of the old guards regarding that he took Al-Qaeda seriously. He's one of the very few. At the time, during the early 90s, it was not even an agenda filler regarding the Bush senior or the Clinton administration until the CIA got involved and started giving intelligence to Clinton. And it was Clarke who basically spearheaded the counterterrorism center and basically said that Al-Qaeda needs to be taken seriously. And when George Tenet became the DCI, his information told him, and that's previous CIA information, that the group in the Sudan basically was helping to train and arm the Somalian militants under Mohammed Farah Aidid. And if you are familiar with that name, it's more infamous regarding the film Black Hawk Down, which was about the U.S. Special Forces trying to capture Mohammed Farah Aidid and get involved with the end of the civil war there with those radical militants. And it came to later, through many years later, that Al-Qaeda was actually training the Somalian militants in the use of RPGs. And if you notice, that's what the basis of the film Black Hawk Down, these Black Hawk helicopters that came in, where'd they get these rocket-propelled grenades and rocket launchers from? Well, we gave them the Stinger missiles and the rocket-propelled grenades in 1987. Remember, we made a deal through Operation Cyclone in which we used the Pakistan ISI, the intelligence arm, to funnel American weapons to support the Mujahideen against the Soviets. Well, those weapons found their way in Somalia with Al-Qaeda, as well as the Balkans, and probably elsewhere. But more notoriously, it was used in the Sudan in Somalia, regarding the militants' fight against U.S. Special Forces there.
Later in 1998,
If you haven't seen Black Hawk Down, I recommend it. It's a pretty good film.
of course,
Little.
we had the explosions, the attack on the two embassies.
Right.
And shortly after that, the administration took its one military response to terrorism in the attacks on Afghanistan and the Sudan. Were those actions taken on your recommendation? Were you a part of the decision-making process and calling for that reaction?
Senator, I was, but if I may be a little picky, this was not the administration's first or only use of military action in response to terrorism. The administration began in the first 5 months, the Clinton administration, first 5 months of the administration, 6 months, to use military force in response to terrorism.
The first to Al-Qaeda.
First time that we had an Al-Qaeda attack on the United States facilities. It was the first time that Al-Qaeda had attacked us, and we had been told it was Al-Qaeda. In retrospect, many years after these attacks occurred, FBI and CIA began to say that things like the World Trade Center attack in 1993 might have been done by an early stage Al-Qaeda.
In August of 1998, did you recommend a longer lasting military response or just precisely the one that in fact took place?
I recommended a series of rolling attacks against the infrastructure in Afghanistan. Every time they would rebuild it, I proposed that we blow it up again. Much like, in fact, we were doing in Iraq, where we had a rolling series of attacks on their air defense system.
Right now, look, there's the problem with this is that you have what they call as the national security brief, where you have, and I've said this before in other videos, where you have the heads of the intelligence agencies, right, as well as the highest levels of officials in the White House, like the Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, the head of the director of the CIA, director of the FBI. They talk about the threats, the current threats to the country's security. And during this, Clinton, now remember, international terrorism was not at the #1 position, right? So, but still, Clinton really respected Clarke, and he would have him chair these meetings. That didn't happen in the Bush administration because he saw Clarke as a holdover of the Clinton administration. So, and they never took counterterrorism seriously anyway. However, Clinton did. And Clinton basically wanted Clarke's ideas and thoughts about how to handle the situation in the Sudan and later Afghanistan. So what they did was basically have the John O'Neill, the head of the Counterterrorism Center, Bin Laden Center in New York, come to these meetings every once in a while. You had Louis Freeh, George Tenet, and Sandy Berger, who was the Secretary of National Security Advisor. So these people would share, but now, you have the Joint Chiefs of Staff there. And what they did, they would come up with ideas and operations about how to capture or kill Osama Bin Laden. And after the first fatwa, and shortly after, especially after the U.S. Embassy bombings, the rendition program, which didn't start under Bush, it started under Clinton, it didn't start till much later, but he authorized it because what they wanted to do was capture, I think, this Egyptian militant and bring him back to the States, and they did. He was the first rendition operation, I forgot his name. But they wanted to try that with Bin Laden. And the ideas that Clinton was bringing up were like something out of Hollywood, right? So you get the Joint Chiefs of Staff listening to this and saying, oh, the group, we can send, like Clinton once said, we could send like a group of these ninjas, according to him, that was the special forces, into in Bin Laden's house in Afghanistan, which was guarded by the Taliban, by the way. And he thinks that, like only a group of 10 people could go in there and capture him and just, hightail it out there. Boy, don't you wish it was that easy, right? No. Joint Chiefs basically laughed. He said, this guy's living in Hollywood. And that would be right, because what the hell does Clinton know about special or black operations? He's just the president. And he would need a bigger contingent than that because, he had Al-Qaeda, he had the Taliban there guarding him. And so you would have these ideas about using the new drone program at the time that was brand new. Nobody knew how to use it or how, whether it was, how could I say it? Whether it was a valid source of like using it as an assassination tool, and nobody wanted to take it. So in other words, all these ideas and all these situations, nobody wanted to take action. And that was the problem in the Clinton administration. That was a huge glaring problem.
Shortly after that, you came up with the so-called Delenda plan, as I understand it. And is our staff report accurate in saying that it had 4 principal approaches: diplomacy, covert action, various financial members, and military action? Is that a reasonable summary?
Yes,
that
sir.
Our staff has given us?
Yes, sir.
And is our staff accurate in saying that the strategy was never formally adopted, but that you were authorized in effect to go ahead with the first 3, but not with the 4th?
Yes, sir.
And at various times thereafter, you did recommend specific military responses under specific circumstances, did you not?
Yes, sir.
Each of which was rejected for one reason or another.
That's correct.
Then in the early winter of 1999, when the CIA came up with a plan to attack a hunting camp in Afghanistan, at which it felt that Osama bin Laden was present or was not present, that recommendation or that plan was ultimately aborted. Did you recommend against that plan?
Okay, this, for those who don't know, there was intelligence relayed to the Counterterrorism Center at the CIA that bin Laden was in a meeting with, was at somewhere in, I forgot, in Afghanistan. However, the intelligence that Clarke got was basically that it was a wedding party or whatever. But there was a meeting as well. And at the meeting, they basically wanted to strike bin Laden with a missile from above, a drone strike actually. And they advised against it because they didn't know what they got was intelligence on the ground was that there was a couple of United Arab Emirati princes at this meeting. And basically, Clarke went against it. And I think this was around the same time where Clarke and Michael Scheuer, who was on his way out as the chief of Alex Station, the Bin Laden Issue Station, he was replaced that year by Richard Lee. And I think it was basically because he was so insular and very hard to deal with, even according to CIA standards. So and Scheuer basically had arguments with Clarke about, Scheuer was aggressive. He knew the dangers of bin Laden, but so did Clarke. But again, no action taken. Scheuer basically didn't care. If 20 people had to get killed, so be it, as long as the target was killed. And the White House couldn't afford that. And the reason why they couldn't afford that was because their interests were at stake.
Yes, Senator Wright.
And, when it comes to the United States, their interest comes before.
What I did was to call the Director of Central Intelligence and say that I had finally been presented with satellite photography of the facility. And it was very clear to me that this looked like something other than a terrorist camp. It looked like a luxury hunting trip. And I asked him to look into it personally. When he did, he called back and he said that he was no longer recommending the attack.
Okay. So you never recommended either for or against an attack on that camp?
Well, I think, I don't want to split hairs. By calling the Director of Central Intelligence and suggesting to him that this did not look to me like a terrorist facility and urging him to look into it.
Scheuer actually went to Tenet, gave him this information, and Tenet went to Clarke, and Clarke shot it down.
He certainly had the impression that I wasn't in favor of it. Absolutely.
Well, Did it make any difference as to what kind of camp it was, if it was likely that Osama bin Laden was there?
Well, it did, and in two respects. The administration had adopted a policy with regard, let me back up. After the bombings in 1998, we kept submarines off the coast of Pakistan, loaded with cruise missiles, for the purpose of launching a follow-on attack when we could locate bin Laden. The intelligence that we got about where bin Laden was very poor. The DCI, Mr. Tennant, characterized that intelligence himself on repeated occasions as very poor. On one occasion, we thought we knew where he was, and there were two problems. One, the intelligence was poor, according to George Tennant, and two, the collateral damage would have been great, according to the Pentagon. When I looked at this facility, it looked to me like the intelligence was again poor, because it didn't look like a terrorist camp, and the probability of collateral damage would have been high, I thought, since I believed, based on the satellite photography, that people other than terrorists were there. The decision ultimately was George Tennant's, and George Tennant recommended no action be taken. I don't know in retrospect, your staff might, but I don't know in retrospect whether it proved to be true that bin Laden was in the vicinity or not.
In any event,
Now, as you can see, when it comes to action, nobody wanted to take it. It was almost like they had all these ideas about assassinating bin Laden. And that goes, and it's, not just in 1999, but in 1998, in 1992, the CIA actually were trailing bin Laden at his home in Khartoum, Sudan. I mentioned this a couple of times previously. Just recently, I did a video about doing a breakdown where I mentioned that there was a CIA operative, a legendary a field officer named Billy Waugh, who was involved with the capture of Carlos the Jackal, the infamous terrorist from Europe, that's based out of South America, but he did terrorist operations in Europe. And it was him and Cofer Black that helped capture him. But he said that Billy Waugh used to have a regiment where he would jog near the home of bin Laden in Khartoum. And bin Laden would actually be walking by with his contingent of security detail, and he'd wave and just walk away. And he told the Counterterrorism Center that I could get close by where I could probably kill him with a rock. But Clinton didn't want to take action because that information was relayed to Clinton, and Clinton said no. So
every recommendation for military action or covert action from late 1998 until the year 2000 ran up against the objection of actionable, that it was not based on actionable intelligence, that wonderful phrase we've heard in the last 2 days. Is that not correct? Because of uncertainty as to whether bin Laden was present, uncertainty about collateral damage, et cetera.
That's true in describing actions aimed at Osama bin Laden himself. There were other covert action activities taken, which we obviously can't go into here, but there was a pre-existing finding on terrorism under which CIA was operating, and CIA was able to do some things outside of Afghanistan against the Al-Qaeda network using that authority.
see, the CIA actually said later on that they had constraints about doing black operations. Now, this is coming from the Church Committee hearings of 1977, where they investigated the intelligence services and the CIA about the use of their loosely based regulations about assassinations, covert ways to assassinate people, subverting governments abroad. So this came to light in the Church Committee hearings, and they basically put like this black mark on the agency itself, and it, deservingly so. However, throughout the years, the CIA just sat in the shadows and basically just behaved to an extent than how they previously were working. And then when George Tenet came, and after when Stansfield Turner served as the CIA director under Reagan, after that, Tenet became the DCI, and he was seen as a reformer. And what he wanted to do is, stop with these field officers, right? He wanted to put in bureaucrats because he wanted to change the agency to become more financially, wanted to bring in more financial benefits into the agency to build upon new centers like the National Security, the Special Activities Division, a really special covert group. I forgot the name of it, and I can't think of it right now. Anyway, what he wanted to bring was he wanted to brown nose, at these functions where you would have, White House officials and their affiliates, corporate junkers and whatnot. And he wanted to brown nose these people because basically they would get the CIA back into what he wanted was back in the public eye. That's what he wanted. And he basically did. 9/11 actually was, that gave him every opportunity to do that and then some, and he did. And not only that, they broke every damn law in the book after 9/11. The rendition program, the torture program, you could thank the CIA. That was the CIA doing that, all at the behest of the State Department under George Bush, under Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld, and the White House lawyers like John Yoo and David Attenborough. So Tenet basically just, from the first years he was DCI, he basically gave new positions, took out Scheuer, put in Richard Blee for the chief of Alex Station, put in Cofer Black as the head of the Counterterrorism Center. And all these guys basically were bureaucrats. Black was, and so was Richard Blee, and so was John McLaughlin. So a lot of these people, right? And basically the CIA fired under Tenet, basically, and this is written in the book Jawbreaker by Gary Bernstein. Bernstein claims that Tenet fired so many or forced retirement on so many CIA field officers. And instead, management, which I think labeled the third floor, the sixth floor, he always mentioned him by the floor. I forgot the name of the floor. But he said management grew, and they grew and grew and grew. And you have all these fresh faces coming in there that back in the early advent of the CIA, you had to be a field officer and work your way to the top, like James Jesus Angleton, or Alan Dulles, or Stansfield Turner, or Richard Helms. These guys earned their position, and they were seen as brilliant minds, even though they were sociopaths.
And at the very end of the Clinton administration, after the attack on the Cole, there was triggered either by the Cole or by everything else that a new set of initiatives resulting in what is called a blue sky memo. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yes.
And were you
okay, now they don't describe what the blue sky memo is, and let me do that for you, because you probably never heard of it. And I understand, it's a very, it's not spoken even by veteran 9/11 researchers. So Blue Sky Memo is a document authorized by the Central Intelligence Agency in response to the, as Slade Gorton said, the USS Cole bombing. The premise of the memo was to describe actions the CIA should undertake if it didn't have to operate legally. So what they wanted to do was basically, after the bombing of the USS Cole, the CIA grew frustrated with the restrictions afforded to the agency. Now, they were put there by the Church Committee hearings for good measure, because the CIA wanted didn't want to act under any regulations at all. They wanted to conduct coups and assassinations with impunity. Well, guess what? After 9/11, they actually did. And look what they did, right? That's the reason why they had these restrictions put upon them by Frank Church. Now, the memo, like I said, was inspired by the Cole bombing, and it was written, it was authored, I want to say like 2 or 3 weeks before Clinton left office. And it was delivered to Richard Clarke on December 29th, 2000. Now, there's a small footnote. I don't know what page it is, but it's in the 9/11 Commission, where I'm going to read you the quote. Quote, no action was taken on these ideas in the few remaining weeks of the Clinton administration. National Security Advisor Sandy Berger did not recall seeing or being briefed on the Blue Sky memo, nor was the memo discussed during the transition with incoming top Bush administration officials. CIA Director George Tenet and his deputy told us, James Pavitt, told us they pressed these ideas as options after the new administration took office. And that, by the way, that's not a footnote. That's in chapter 6 of the 9/11 Commission, end quote, by the way. And so the Blue Sky memo outlined what they wanted to do without constraints. Now, if they did that, maybe they could have killed bin Laden, but who's to say that's to stop it with bin Laden? And, you know, let's just say he was at a meeting, and around this meeting, there's like houses and whatnot. And if they shot a drone into it, they would have killed people next door to the house, but they don't care. Right? That's what they wanted. That's what Scheuer wanted, and that's what Tenet wanted. And they got that. After 9/11, as Cofer Black said, the gloves came off. In other words, the committee, church committee hearings, I don't give a damn. National security comes at first, right? And they don't give a damn about national security or the welfare of the American people. We're talking about the CIA here, okay? What they did was act without, like, you know, the kid in a candy store, right? Mom just let him loose. And look what happened. I mean, CIA basically lied about Iraq. They basically were the ones who, tortured a lot of these people in these CIA black sites in Poland, in Egypt, in Germany, Afghanistan, and there was a number of CIA black sites. The rendition program, where the CIA actually used private planes, even passenger planes, to rendition somebody out of the country. A lot of these people weren't even Al-Qaeda or had no affiliations with terrorism. At one point, I think Guantanamo Bay had over 836 prisoners. Don't quote me on the exact number, but it's like over 800. How many are there now? I think it's 26. They had to let go of all these people. So that was the nature of the Blue Sky memo anyway. So we'll go back to Slade Gorton there.
Part of that was did you draft it? Was it your plan?
The Blue Sky memo, I believe you're referring to, was part of an overall update of the Delenda plan. And it was a part generated by the Central Intelligence Agency. My staff, generated the rest of the update.
And the goal of that plan was to roll back Al-Qaeda over a period of 3 to 5 years, reducing it eventually to a rump group like other terrorist organizations around the world?
Our goal was to do that, to eliminate it as a threat to the United States, recognizing that one might not ever be able to totally eliminate everybody in the world who thought they were a member of Al-Qaeda. But if we could get it to be as ineffective as the Abu Nidal organization was toward the end of its existence, it didn't pose a threat to the United States.
Yeah.
That's what we wanted. CIA said that if they got all the resources they needed, that might be possible over the course of 3 years at the earliest.
And then Delenda and that Blue Sky proposal, I take it, were pretty much the basis of what you recommended to Condoleezza Rice in January of 2001. Covert alliance, covert assistance to the Northern Alliance.
Yeah,
More money for
right.
CIA activities.
Now we're
Something
talking.
called choosing a standard of evidence for attributing responsibility for the coal. New Predator reconnaissance missions and more work on funding.
That's right, Senator. The update to the Delenda plan that we did in October, November, December of 2000 was handed to the new National Security Advisor in January of 2001. It formed the basis of the draft National Security Presidential Directive that was then discussed in September of 2001 and signed by President Bush as NSPD 9, I believe, later in September.
Okay, let's stop right there, because what I want to bring up is that memo. And so to do that, I'll have to share with you. It was written on January 25th, 2001, or was handed over to the Rice in January of 2001. So here it is. Memorandum for Condoleezza Rice, information president, and I'll blow it up so you can see it better. Presidential Policy Initiative Review of the Al-Qaeda Network. And basically what Clarke was doing was briefing Bush administration officials about the looming threat of Al-Qaeda. And basically he outlined this 3-page memo, just some terrorist group. As we noted in our briefings for Al-Qaeda, look how he spelled it, QIDA, is not some narrow little terrorist issue that needs to be included in broader regional policy. Rather, several of our regional policies need to address centrally the transnational challenge to the United States and our interests posed by the Al-Qaeda network. And as you can see, there's this plans that he was talking about, the first, second, third, right? And threat magnitude, strategy, the fiscal year budgets that's needed, and decisions. We initialize funding to the Northern Alliance and to the Uzbeks. Now, that's a great point, because Ahmad Shah Massoud in that year of 2001 went to, I think, France and basically pled with the world. This is just about a month before he was assassinated. He actually said that the United States and the United Nations should support the Northern Alliance in their fight against the Taliban, because if they don't, Al-Qaeda is preparing an attack to the United States. Well, 2 days before 9/11, Ahmad Shah Massoud was assassinated by 2 Al-Qaeda operatives posing as journalists. I think they were from, Tunisia, but they weren't. And that coordination took about a month or two, because they had to go to an intermediary in Egypt to talk with him first. And he didn't do any background checks on these 2 guys. And the guy from Egypt said, hey, Massoud, yeah, maybe we could set something up in an interview with these 2 guys. They're journalists. And Massoud agreed, and he was killed. So that's the memo that's here. And you know what? I'll link this to the description so you can read it for yourself.
What do you mean by a standard?
And look at it.
Of evidence.
Contents of it.
I'm troubled by this fuzzy phrase, actionable intelligence.
Senator,
Did you feel let's take the coal on that, as we've heard from Director Tenet in November, and then more precisely in December of 2000, they'd pretty much concluded that the coal took place through Al-Qaeda people, but they couldn't prove that it had been directed by Osama Bin Laden. Was the amount of intelligence available in November, December of 2000 and 2001, in your view, actionable intelligence that could have been the appropriate basis for a specific response to the coal?
The phrase that you read, the standard for actionable, was a way of my addressing this problem. And I wanted to get us away from having to prove, either in a court of law legal standard or even in some fancy intelligence community standard, that went through a prolonged process that took months. I thought we could disassociate the attack on the Cole from any attacks that we did on the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. If people wanted to further study who was guilty of attacking the Cole, and the FBI had deployed hundreds of people to do that, and CIA was saying that there were some people involved who might have been Al-Qaeda, I thought, fine, if you want to have that kind of standard and you want to have that kind of process, fine, then let's separate that and let's bomb Afghanistan anyway and not tie the two together. But it seemed to my staff, who were looking at the same intelligence that the CIA was looking at, it seemed to us within 2 days of the attack on the Cole that we could put together an intelligence case that this was an Al-Qaeda attack by the local Al-Qaeda cell in Yemen. And that is, of course, the conclusion that the CIA came to in January or February of the next year, based on pretty much nothing but the evidence that we had available to us within 2 days.
Now, since my yellow light is on at this point, my final question will be this. Assuming that the recommendations that you made on January 25th of 2001, based on DeLinda, based on Blue Sky, including aid to the Northern Alliance, which had been an agenda item at this point for 2.5 years without any action, assuming that there had been more Predator reconnaissance missions, and assuming that that had all been adopted, say, on January 26th, year 2001, is there the remotest chance that it would have prevented 9/11?
No.
It just would have allowed our response after 9/11 to be perhaps a little bit faster.
Well, the response would have begun before 9/11.
But, yes, but we weren't going to, there was no recommendation on your part or anyone else's part that we declare war and attempt to invade Afghanistan prior to 9/11.
That's right.
When it comes to the USS Cole bombing, there's a lot of problems because, you know, people don't realize that Yemen was a haven for Al-Qaeda affiliates. Bin Laden was born in Yemen. And that there was a large presence of Al-Qaeda affiliates. Al-Qaeda in Yemen still exists to some extent. That was like before. There were a number of people that were laid blame to the attacks. One of them was Abid al I'm sorry, al-Nashiri. I want to say it's al-Nashiri. Abd al-Rahim al-Nashiri. Okay, Abd al-Rahim al-Nashiri. And later on, it was Tawfiq bin Attash, whose nickname is Khalad. And there were others that were involved with the planning and coordination, like Fahad al-Kuso and Muhammad al-Badawi. The planning for this attack was originally in the Millennium Plot. And what they wanted to do was attack a military installation abroad, not inside the United States. That didn't come until 1999. But in the Millennium Plot, they wanted to bomb a USS naval warship called the USS Sullivans. But the boat that was carrying the bombs, there were so many bombs in this boat that it sank the boat into the sea. Approximately 10 months later, because it was October 2000 when the Cole bombing happened, and January of 2000 when Millennium Plot took place. Tawfiq bin Attash, who was the money handler and the operations manager allegedly for Al-Qaeda, he basically coordinated an attack on Yemen, USS Cole, of the port of Yemen, okay? And there was these two martyrdom operators, I don't know their names, and they basically outfitted the boat with explosives, and I think it killed, 30 people and, did damage. But the emboldened nature of Al-Qaeda was becoming more, they were becoming more confident in their attack on the United States. And what Bin Laden wanted, evidently, was he wanted in 1998, and he didn't get, was a military response to Afghanistan. Bin Laden knew that he couldn't beat the US military with Al-Qaeda. He knew that. What he wanted to do was have the United States as a repeat of what the Soviets did in Afghanistan, overextend into the country. Because Afghanistan is, the nickname is the graveyard of empires. No foreign country is ever defeated in history. And so the Soviets were considered a superpower, just like the United States were. When he bombed the US embassy bombings, I mean, the embassy in Tanzania and Kenya, he thought that the United States would enter Afghanistan in 98. That didn't happen. The USS Cole bombing, that didn't happen. He actually gave praise to Clinton because he said Clinton was smart. He didn't overextend his hand. 9/11 happens, the plane operations happen. What does Bush do? The dumb idiot basically went all in. Now, was this also predicted by the neocons? Because in the foreign policy reports that they created in the 90s, such as the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which later became the Bush Doctrine, the Project for New American Century, they needed an event to happen. Remember, Project New American Century, remember that one part truthers like to bring up? We need a catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor in order for these outlines to come true. Well, another event was 9/11. 9/11 was basically a huge bonus for the intelligence community, private military industrialists, the Pentagon, State Department, and their foreign allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel. So it afforded them to destabilize the Middle East, to end or continue, not totally end, but erode the civil liberties of Americans and to citizens around the world. Because the NSA now collects all our signals intelligence, as well as other intelligence agencies of signals intelligence, like the GCHQ in Great Britain, I think the CNC or the CTC in Canada, and they're called the Five Eyes. And I talked about this before about the signals intelligence agencies that share data with one another, and even not just terrorists. It was never about terrorism. It was about us, common people. Patriot Act, the National Defense Authorization Act, the CIA and the NSA getting blank checks, all the agencies grew bigger and bigger and bigger and more powerful. And also the regulations that were afforded to an agency like the CIA no longer exist. And now we have the world that we have now. And it's thanks in part to certain people who withheld information that they could have used to start monitoring Al-Qaeda operatives inside the United States pre-9/11. We're talking about years prior to the event, and didn't act on it. Now, whether you want to say they allowed the attacks to happen, which is a reasonable scenario, or that they were just ignorant and didn't know what they were doing. But the NSA would know because they were listening to the phone calls of Osama Bin Laden and to the house in the Al-Qaeda communications hub in Sana'a, Yemen. And they were listening to those calls for years. What do you think they were talking on those phones? Yeah. So see you in the next video.